once a rich mining community.
You got a corporation, a giant, right in our backyard, turned around and just became a cemetery.
We had a cancer here. We had a cancer here.
What I have in my body right now, no human being should have.
They ruined me, destroyed my life.
Look at this thing, it's full of paint sludge.
There's almost no one in the group that is healthy.
Ford will pay. This is punishment time.
I can't change what happened to us. I'm not going to stop this fight. And I don't care where I got to go, what I got to do.
Lips, ladies, lips.
They could apply it to each other and literally make themselves radiate. It turns out the company knew all along about the harmful effects of radium.
Hey guys, welcome back to my YouTube channel. Here it's me here, Lavender here, and I'm back with the anti-capitalism deep dive topic today. Today I'm going to be doing the paint industry files, a deep dive into that. So let's get started into this new YouTube video. But before I get started, here are a list of my YouTube videos that are related to this topic if you'd like to check them out. So let's get started into this video. So yeah. Paint production is also one of the most water-intensive industries, using as much as 20 liters of water for every 1 liter of paint produced. The process of creating paint consumes a large amount of water and chemicals, which leads to the production of large amounts of wastewater. Roughly 70% of wastewater production by the paint manufacturing industry is released into natural bodies of water, which causes the destination to be polluted. The industry generates between 75 and 85 million gallons of wastewater per day. The plastic in paint is massively polluting the ocean. A just-released study paints a dire picture. A report released by the Swiss research firm Environmental Action illustrates the devastating effects and impact of paint, specifically the plastic within our paint on our planet. The study's findings suggest that paint could be the largest single source of microplastic pollution, accounting for 1.9 million tons, or 58% of total volume, being deposited into the world's oceans. This amount, according to the report, vastly exceeds previous estimates of between 9 and 21%. Just as concerning, perhaps, is that of the 18 million tons of plastic contained in paint, 40%, or 7.4 million tons, will eventually leak out into the environment. According to an estimate from the World Economic Forum, the number of microplastics that find their way to the ocean every year by the way of painting, flaking from steel surfaces is equivalent to plastic of 150 to 225 billion empty plastic bottles. The elastic material in paint was once supplied by natural latex from rubber trees. During World War II, as natural raw materials became increasingly scarce, manufacturers began to introduce synthetic petroleum-derived based materials to their formulas. Today, though many paints still have latex in their labels, the word is almost always a misnomer. Most so-called latex paints are composed of more than 1/3 plastic. These additives make the paint more durable, resistant to water, and washable. But as the paint ages, it dries, cracks, and flakes, sending microplastic pollution fragments into the environment and the ocean. These tiny fragments are turning up in the deepest oceans to the highest mountaintops, literally. A 2020 study in the journal One Earth by researchers from the University of Plymouth found microplastic pollution fibers in ice and snow samples taken from the summit of Mount St. Everest. In a study from the same year, Australian researchers reported finding microplastics along the seafloor bed of the Great Australian Bight on the continent's south coast and depths exceeding over 10,000 feet. Microplastic is not merely languishing in the environment, but it's also being ingested by organisms and sea creatures at various levels of the food web. Oxford researchers, for example, found microplastics in a host of deep-sea dwelling organisms and creatures, including sea cucumbers, hermit crabs, and lobsters, and crabs. Hazardous gases are released during the creation and use of paint and can be harmful to people. The World Health Organization has determined that exposure to suspended particulate matter can lead to acute respiratory infection, asthma, lung cancer, cardiovascular disease, and chronic obstructive lung disease to people working with it. The volatile chemicals and organic compounds emitted can potentially turn into hazardous biohazard air pollutants. VOCs can cause people to experience eye irritation, breathing difficulty, kidney damage, and cancer. Heavy metals are used in paints have raised concerns due to their toxicity levels at high levels of exposure, and since they build up in the food chain. Lead paint contains lead as a pigment. Lead is also added to paint to speed drying, increase durability, retain a fresh appearance, and resist moisture that causes corrosion. Although banned in many countries, paint with significant lead levels and content is still used in areas such as Eastern Europe and Asia, most commonly for industry purposes like anti-corrosive paint. For example, leaded paint is sometimes used as to paint roadways and parking lot lines. Lead, a poisonous metal, can damage nerve connections, especially in young children, and can cause blood and brain disorders. True crime cases involving paint in some way. How a doctor discovered U.S. walls were poisonous. Humans have mined and used lead for over 6,000 years. Across time, the palatable soft metal has been fashioned into tools and utensils, used as a sweetener for wines, and even to provide an extra kick to the gallon of gasoline or add a gleaming sheen to a coat of paint. But it was not up until March 29th, 1979, that the pediatrician and a child psychiatrist named Herbert Needleman first documented the dangers of even the lowest forms of lead exposure. Sometime in the late 1950s, however, Dr. Needleman observed that patients with milder cases of lead poisoning kept returning to the emergency room over and over again soon after being treated. And when these children returned for follow-up visits, Needleman noted a number of the unruly behaviors among many of them. Sadly, these children lived in homes, typically unkept slum houses in the inner city, riddled with lead paint flaking off the walls and window sills. Small children who tend to explore the world with their mouths, like eating the lead chips of paint because they tasted sweet. When lead paint chips are broken down, one is left with a toxic dust that is easily inhaled. Paint companies were required to remove lead from their products in 1978. Nevertheless, more than 38 million homes in the United States alone contain deteriorating lead-painted walls. Landlords refuse to update these homes because it costs so much money. The renting parents have neither the funds nor the access to safer housing elsewhere. Hypothesizing that no amount of lead was safe, Dr. Needleman focused on the psychological effects of much lower levels of lead poisoning. It was an idea that changed the entire scientific and environmental toxicology. Rather than studying how much of exposure to a particular toxin it took to kill somebody, he insisted on training the minimum amounts that can cause subtle but nevertheless damaging effects. Eventually, science and the technology to measure trace but dangerous exposure to environmental toxins caught up with his theory. Lead typically settles in the bones and teeth of the body. Consequently, Needleman collected the baby teeth an easy and painless way to gather bone samples of first and second graders living in Boston. Some of them had been exposed to a lot of lead and others who had not. What he found was that children with high concentrations of lead levels scored far less well on IQ tests than those kids with lower lead levels. He reported these findings in a landmark paper in the New England Journal of Medicine on this very day. 34 years ago. Not surprisingly, Needleman made real enemies among these working in the lead industries who feared the financial ramifications of the lawsuits resulting from trying decades of lead paint exposure to the poor health of millions of children. These corporations and companies waged a 13-year war by ferreting out Needleman's work with every mistake and error in detail, hiring a team of their own scientists, and lead companies and their surrogates accusing him of scientific research fraud, falsification, and plagiarism, none of which of those charges stuck because they could not prove he was wrong. Sunday's Wake refers to an episode 4 of season 11 of the television true crime series Forensic Files. When a little African girl got sick and died, investigators were stumped. Was it an accident, unexplained illness, or murder? Scientists would travel halfway around the world before finding the answer in two unlikely places: a shredded legal document and her mother's signature. On March 29, 2000, a 2-year-old Sudanese African girl was seen at a community hospital emergency room (ER) with low-grade fever and vomiting. She was discharged from the ER a short time later with an antibiotic to treat what was presumed to be a strep throat infection. Her vomiting worsened, and she was then readmitted to the same hospital and then transferred to another hospital. She became unresponsive 5 hours after the transfer and was incubated and placed on a ventilator. Computerized tomography showed that she had dilated ventricles and showed diffuse cerebral edema. Later that day, the results of the blood test drawn showed a BLL of 391 UG/DL. This sparked an investigation by the Manchester Health Department and New Hampshire Department of Health and Human Services. The wall of the apartment and family moved into in March 2000 had multiple holes from which the patient had been removing and ingesting the plaster, and 2 of the 7 samples from the apartment contained lead at levels 5% and 12%. Peeling paint, 35% lead, was present on the bolsters and floor. 3% lead of a porch outside where the apartment where the girl had played sometimes. The summary of this Forensic Files episode is that the landlord was jailed for 15 months for violating lead disclosure rule after the patient consumed paint and plaster in a rental property, aka apartment complex, and died of lead poisoning. Under the U.S. regulation, all buyers and renters of pre-1978 housing must be notified of lead paint hazards. The lead disclosure rule is a federal rule in the USA. The Radium girls were female factory workers who contracted radiation poisoning from painting radium dials, watch dials, and hands with self-luminous paint. The incidents occurred at 3 factories in the United States. One in Orange, New Jersey, beginning around 1917, one in Ottawa, Illinois, beginning in the early 1920s, and one in Waterbury, Connecticut, also in the 1920s. This true crime case has been featured in a number of TV and media, such as a fictionalized account version of the story was featured in the Spike TV show 1,000 Ways to Die, episode 196, and the Science Channel's Dark Matters, Twisted But True. The story is also told in Eleanor Swanson's poem Radium Girls, collected in 1,000 Bonds, Marie Curie and Discovery of Radium. Michael Monotone's short story, It's Time, is told from the perspective of an unnamed radium girl. From 1917 to 1926, U.S. Radium Corporation, originally called the Radium Luminous Material Corporation, was engaged in the extraction and purification of radium from concrete ore to produce luminous paints, which were marked under the brand name Undark. The ore was mined from the Portadox Valley in Colorado and other Undark mines in Utah. As a defense contractor, U.S. Radium was a major supplier of radio elements watches to the military. Their plant in Orange, New Jersey employed as many as 300 workers, mainly women, to paint radium-lit watches, faces, and instruments, misleading them that it was safe. After being told the paint was harmless and safe, the women in each facility ingested deadly amounts of radium after being instructed to point their brushes on their lips in order to give them a fine tip. Some also painted their fingernails, faces, and teeth with the glowing substance. The women were instructed to point their brushes in this way because using rags or a water rinse caused them to use more time and material. As the paint was made from powdered radium, U.S. Radium Corporation, the USRC, hired approximately 70 women to perform various tasks, including handling radium, while the owners and the scientists familiar with the effects of radium carefully avoided any exposure to it themselves. An estimated 4,000 workers were hired by corporations in the U.S. and Canada to paint watch faces with radium. The rate of pay for painting 250 dials a day was about $0.015 per dial. The brushes would lose shape after a few strokes, so the USRC supervisors and managers encouraged their workers to point the brushes with their lips or their tongues to keep them sharp. Dentists were among the first to see numerous health problems among dial painters. Dental pain, loose teeth, lesions, and ulcers. The failure of tooth extractions to heal were some of these conditions. Many of the women later began to develop anemia, bone fractures, and necrosis of the jaw, a condition now known as radium jaw. The woman also experienced suppression of menstruation and became sterile. It is thought that the X-ray machines used by these medical investigators may have contributed to some of the sickened workers' ill health by subjecting them to additional radiation. It turned out that at least one of the examinations was a ruse, part of a campaign to spread disinformation and propaganda started by the defense contractor U.S. Radium, with other watchdog companies rejecting claims that the affected workers were suffering from exposure to radium. For some time, doctors, dentists, and researchers complied with requests from the companies not to release their scientific data. In 1923, as the first dial painter died, before her death, her jaw fell all the way off from her skull. By 1924, 50 women who had worked the plant were ill, and a dozen had died. At the urging of the companies, medical professionals attributed worker deaths and other causes to syphilis, a notorious sexual transmitted infection at the time. It was often cited as attempts to smear the reputations of these victims of capitalism. Because the true nature the radium had been kept from them, the radium girls also painted their nails, teeth, and faces for fun with the deadly paint produced at the factory. Many of the workers became sick. Over 30 died from exposure to radiation by 1927. The inventor of radium dial paint, Dr. Sabian Arnold, died in November of 1928, becoming the 16th known victim of poisoning by radium dial paint. He had gotten sick from the radium in his hands, not the jaw, but the circumstances of his death helped boost the Radium Girls court case with their lawsuit. The Radium Girls case was settled in autumn of 1928 before the trial was deliberated by the jury, and the settlement for each of the Radium Girls was around $10,000, equivalent to $170,000 in 2022, and a $600 a year per immunity. The Radium Girls saga holds an important place in the history of both the field of health, physics, science, and the labor rights movement. The right of individual workers to sue for damages from corporations due to labor abuse was established as a result of the Radium Girls case. The lawsuit and resulting publicity was a factor in the establishment of the occupational disease labor law. Radium dial painters were instructed in proper safety handling precautions and provided with protective gear. In particular, they no longer shaped paintbrushes by lip and avoided ingesting or breathing in the paint. Radium paint was still used in dials as late as the 1970s. The scientific impact of this case, the Centers for Human Radiobiology, was established at National Laboratory in 1968. The primary purpose of the center was providing medical examinations for these victims. The project also focused on the collection of information, in some cases tissue samples, from the radium dial painters. The project ended in 1993. Detailed information of over 2,400 cases plus had been collected. This led to a book on the effects of radium on humans and the health effects. The book suggests that radium-228 exposure is more harmful to human health than exposure to radium-226, because the radium-228 is more likely to cause bone cancer. Cancer Road, a Ford factory dumped toxic paint sludge on indigenous tribal land. Years later, it's still making people sick. When a victim of capitalism named Angel was a kid, she would often play in the dirt. A lot of kids in her area did the same, but the dirt in the hills around her home in Upper Ringwood, a close-knit working-class family neighborhood in the shadow of the Ramapo Mountains in New Jersey, was special. It was often bright and multicolored. It glistened in the sun and had a particular scent/smell. Those streaks of color in the soil became from thousands of tons of leftover paint that was dumped decades ago by the Ford Motor Company. It was brought by truck from the company's giant factory in Mahwah, just down the road, and disposed of in an abandoned Ringwood mines. The residents of Ringwood knew where the paint came from, but they didn't know the full health impact it would have until years later, when many of them began falling sick and seriously ill. They petitioned for years to local authorities to help clean up the mess, to no avail. In 2005, a months-long investigation by the Record of New Jersey titled Toxic Legacy found high levels of toxic chemicals in the paint sludge that still littered the area. Following the public pressure, the Environmental Protection Agency oversaw several more investigations into how much of the paint remained and what it contained. The investigation confirmed what the locals had already known for years. It was toxic, it was poisonous, and it was everywhere. The toxic sludge in which Angel and her friends and family had all played contained a plethora of deadly chemicals such as lead, arsenic, benzene, etc. Millions of cars were built on the Maha assembly line. They passed through a long hall where gleaming steel bodies would be sprayed with brightly colored paint, candy apple red, calypso coral, new lime colors. Runoff that would spray would drip down through a steel grate into large vat containers, and then on trucks heading to Upper Ringwood. Their final destination was the Ringwood Mines, a series of now unused abandoned mine shafts and tunnels bought by the Ford Company specifically to use as a landfill dumping ground. Angel's parents would watch these trucks go by their homes. They knew something wasn't quite right, but even back then. But they didn't have the full story. They knew they were being dumped something, but just didn't have the slightest clue as to what it was. She says, my mom, dad, my grandparents, people were playing this stuff for years, and nobody really understood what it was. Ford closed its Maha plant in 1980. 2 years later, regulators found arsenic in the water supply. In the years after Ford closed its factory, the company either donated or sold all of its contaminated properties and land while fully aware of the land was contaminated with toxic materials and chemicals according to the lawsuit brought to them. The legal battle was filmed for an HBO documentary called Man vs. Ford, which was released in 2011. Ford eventually settled for $10 million while admitting they had no liability for the residents' claims of health problems caused by the waste. The money did help some people fix their homes, as well as to pay for some of their medical bills, but then there were people who the money couldn't fix the damage that had already been done. This is a classic case of environmental racism, and these people are victims of capitalism. To allow that stuff to happen to the civilians of that town, the only way for that to happen and take place is, unfortunately, that they were racist people and, victims of capitalism. They thought less of us than themselves. Because capitalism puts profits over the lives of animals, people, and Mother Earth herself, including the environment. Immigrant painters who say employers threaten deportation, get wage theft settlement. Current and former workers of Unforgivable Coatings, a painting company with operations in Nevada and 4 other states, say they found justice after enduring years of unpaid overtime and unfair treatment, including threats of deportation if they spoke up and out against this. After several settlement conferences, parties came to an agreement on Friday evening entitling employees to nearly $3.7 million in compensation for stolen wages, aka wage theft, penalties, damages, and interest as a result of a federal Department of Labor investigation.